Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. My name is Delia Arellano Weddleton, and I am the Director of Engagement and Partnerships at the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. We are a funder that is based in Quincy, and we focus on advancing racial equity in our public school systems throughout the New England region, including Boston. We are only days away from a historical moment in Boston, and it provides us time to reflect and time to look forward. So I'm very excited to welcome our panelists today, and I'm going to take a few minutes to ask them each to introduce themselves before we get started. So let me just ask them to open their mics and just introduce yourself and your role, and then we will continue with our welcome. Thank you. Yvonne, could I ask you to say the first hello? Thank you.
Thank you, Delia. It is a pleasure to be here with you and other distinguished guests and with the Boston Globe. Thank you very much for hosting us this afternoon. My name is Espinoza Madrigal. I am the Executive Director of Lawyers for Civil Rights, an organization that provides free legal support to people of color and immigrants, including families and children. It is a pleasure to be here today.
Delia, thank you very much for opening and for sponsoring today's conversation. And I want to thank the Boston Globe, Yvonne and other panelists for being on with us today. This is a really important conversation. My name is John Barrows. I recently served as the Chief of Economic Development for the City of Boston, but before that was a member of the school committee. And as a Executive Director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, we helped to design and open new schools while turning around schools in our neighborhood, and have been honored to work on education for Boston for years, and then most recently ran for mayor. And education, as you know, was a really important topic during the election, and excited to be on this panel today.
Thank you, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ariela Taylor. I am a 17-year-old who goes to the John D. O'Brien School of Mathematics and Science. I'm also a community organizer, so similar to Mr. Barrows, I work as a board member on DSNI. He had a similar position as a youth board member. I also work with teen empowerment through the Boston Community Action Team, and I've done previous works with other nonprofits in Boston, such as Project Hip Hop, and I've also worked with Madison Park Development Corporation. I was recently elected senior class president at my school, so I'm going to be a lot more engaged here in Boston, specifically on education. So happy to be here today.
Thank you all. Boy, that is really impressive and exciting. So I am absolutely very honored to welcome you to this conversation today around what we hope to see from Boston's next mayor in terms of making our schools system more equitable and effective. We know that Boston carries a history of systemic racism, which we can still feel the ripple effects today. We can feel them and we can see them. At the same time, we also see hope. We see hope in the educators and the young people, the parents and other caregivers who are calling for a more equitable and effective system. Therefore, it is our hope that Boston's next mayor, whoever she may be, will center the voice of young people, community members, caregivers, and other parents, especially those of color, in choices that are made about our schools and that impact their lives. We have hope that our schools can be vehicles for transformation and cultural responsiveness, but only if we are able to center those who are most often kept out of the decision-making circles. So with that, I would like to turn it to Jenna to get this conversation started. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Delia, for being here with us. I am delighted to be a part of the panel. I apologize for being here via audio only, unfortunately dealing with some technical issues related to the storm. But I'm so excited to be able to start this conversation. We have an excellent panel of guests with us. We have John Barrows, a former candidate for mayor and the former Chief of Economic Development for the city. We also are lucky to have with us Ariela Taylor. She is a senior at the John D. O'Brien School of Mathematics and Science with a student's perspective on the most pressing problems that we're facing in our city schools. And then I would also like to welcome Yvonne Espinoza Madrigal, who's the Executive Director of Lawyers for Civil Rights. So I think to start the conversation, what would really be interesting to me is to hear some of you talk a little bit about, start in a very basic place, to talk about the role that the mayor actually plays in shaping and directing the city's schools. I think we often like to think of a mayor as being kind of an all-powerful figure, but the realities are much more complicated, of course. So how does a mayor start to exert influence and set an agenda for education? And also, what are actually the limits of the mayor's power in doing so? And I don't know if there's someone who would like to start this off. Yvonne, do you have thoughts on this?
I was going to say we should hear from John Barrows directly. So I do defer to John in kicking us off on this question about the political contours, and then I'll be happy to jump on.
Sure, Yvonne. I can speak to this from having experience as a school committee member under the Menino administration and what that was like, and then I can talk about it as a member of the Walsh administration and how I joined the conversation as a cabinet member, but then how I experienced it as administration with important conversations and decisions being made by the school committee. As a school committee member, it was clear to us by regulation and rules that the school committee's responsibility was to set the policies, approve the budget, programs, and hire and evaluate, and then, if necessary, fire the superintendent of schools. And so we were the governing body, but we also knew that we were appointed by the mayor and had some level of accountability to our appointing authority in the decisions we made, both legally, but also politically. As a school committee member, though, I only agreed to be on because I was going to be an independent voice even within that relationship. And so I remember the conversations with then the education liaison to the school committee, Martha Pierce, the mayor's education liaison, and then with the mayor himself from time to time about what their opinions were, what their positions were. But I never remember being told how to vote or being told what position I should take on something. I remember, in fact, when we needed to vote to close schools while I was a school committee member, I remember the mayor in our conversation saying to me, "John, I know this is a very personal and important decision, and I will support you either way." And I remember that being really important to me as a school committee member. As a member of the Walsh administration, I've talked to school committee members. I have had relationships with them personally. I was a close friend of the chair, the former chair of the school committee, and tried to be as supportive as possible. And it was similar, that they understood their role as being the governance, the policy-making body, the body that was responsible for the superintendent, but also one that was appointed by the mayor. And I do believe that the mayor has a role to play as a leader in the city, to talk to the school committee, to share information, to hear from them what their thoughts were, and to share his thoughts. But then ultimately, the school committee is the decision-making body and should take those decisions very seriously, consult one another, consult the public, and then make the best decision that they saw fit. I know the schools are dependent on parts of the city system, whether it's administration and finance cabinet or the operations and facilities cabinet. And so the superintendent being able to talk to the mayor often about things that she needs and supports that she needs is important. And the mayor being able to support that gives him lever It gives them some leverage in sort of some of the decisions, but the mayor should ultimately support the superintendent to be an effective manager for the long term.
And John or anyone else, how much is the mayor, should they or have they been the agenda setter in terms of what to prioritize first? We have in Boston certainly a long list of urgent needs. Whose job is it to say this is, at this moment, this is the most important issue that we want to push ahead?
I think the mayor is a very important voice in that agenda setting conversation. And the mayor has the responsibility and should not act like he's not, or she is not at this point. She will not be part of that agenda setting. The mayor should take responsibility and be public about what they think always. And so that it's not just a conversation over the phone or a conversation in the room. And so the mayor should be an active part. And the new mayor should be an active part, sitting with parents, sitting with others, to hear from them, not to undercut the school committee, not to undercut the superintendent, but in fact to be clear that they should be held accountable, particularly in how the committee is appointed today, for the kinds of things that are considered at BPS, the agenda and its priority, and then ultimate decisions that are made.
This is Ivan. I completely agree with John's assessments, and think it is important to this question about the role that the mayor plays. It is important to think of it, and John alluded to some of this, not just in terms of hiring the superintendent and appointing the school committee members, but as agenda setting. That is a critical role, and we've seen it time and time again, where if there are community issues and community priorities, if City Hall does not prioritize that, there is no traction. And so it's important to really acknowledge the fact that City Hall plays a critical role in shaping and really not just voicing, but being an active player in the development of not just policies and practices, but priorities. And so, just a few examples. At Lawyers for Civil Rights, we were very concerned with the deportation of not just one, but multiple students from East Boston High School in connection with student incident reports that were leaked from the school to law enforcement. And those concerns and closing that school to deportation pipeline was only something we were able to target when City Hall prioritized it. If we look more recently during the pandemic at changes that have happened with the highly selective public schools, we are honored to have Ariela with us today, a student in one of these schools at the O'Brien. Changes at the exam schools wouldn't have happened unless some of this was also prioritized within City Hall. Because in previous times, as soon as reform efforts were discussed, City Hall would shut it down. So it's important to acknowledge that gatekeeping role that City Hall has played, which is not surprising when you think about the form of government that we have in Boston, which is a strong mayor form of government.
I think that's such a helpful way to think about it, almost as a gatekeeper opening the door to the prioritization or discussion of certain issues. And I want to take this opportunity to bring Ariela into the conversation. And I'd love to ask you, Ariela, if the new mayor did come to you in the days after the election, and if she were to ask you, what do you think I should do first? What should be my priority in Boston schools? What might you tell her?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I would definitely talk about social and emotional support within BPS. So specifically looking at nurses as well as counselors and teachers. So we know, like, specifically the mayor makes a lot of decisions on the the BPS budget each year. And so this year, like specifically, or the one that we're moving into 2022, a lot more money has been invested in social workers as well as family liaisons, which is really important. I've even started to see this implemented into my O'Brien community. Now we have a family liaison, which is really helpful just with communication within our school. But there's never been a standard for social emotional support within BPS, which creates really traumatic experiences for youth, meaning that some students, whether like some students aren't able to afford therapists, right? So they really rely on their counselors within school to talk about things that are going in on at home as well as in school. But I find, especially with a lot of my friends, they don't feel comfortable reaching out to their counselors because there's always been this level of disconnect. So if you're specifically talking about maybe a racial issue that you're facing in your community and you feel like your counselor isn't actually prepared to start to have those conversations with you, it can lead to you really like not feeling like you have a good support system at school. And this isn't like something new, right? We've been talking about this for a very long time. Like social emotional support is really important for the development of our students in Boston. And it's just not something that we're getting enough. And so that's not just with counselors. And I've talked about this a little bit before. So happy to talk about it today. It's specifically with nurses. So when students are facing something traumatically physically within the body, and they're going to reach out to one of their staff members to kind of like assist with that, or saying, you know, I'm not feeling well. A lot of nurses are very, there's kind of this stereotype that we have in BPS or among students where we're just like, you know, you tell your nurse you're having the worst day ever, and they're just like, you're not going home. Or it's like, you're either going home or like, you know, we can't really say anything about this. And students are just like, oh man, don't go to her. Like if you're having a bad day, like just call your parent or figure it out. Don't go to this person. And it's been really consistent within the BPS schools that I've attended, just not having social emotional support within nurses and our staff. I didn't know if anyone else wanted to add on to that.
Yeah, I'm curious. Do you see? Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Dan, if I could just jump in and just, Ariela was introduced after I was, and just wanted to say how proud I am of her. And I'm a big fan of your leadership and everything that you do. And I agree with you 100%. Social emotional support is incredibly important. And we need to make sure that we're treating students first as humans that are growing and forming and under a lot of pressure, and not as the stats that we typically talk about, right? We talk about grades, we talk about attendance, we talk about, you know, a number of things, but these are forming human beings that are in pressure situations that we need to support. And social emotional support is a good place to start. And you know, some of the decisions that you recognize around what's being funded and not being funded is important. But then it's also about what's being implemented. I mean, the fact that we funded nurses at every school was a really important step, but not all schools have hired nurses, right? And not all schools have implemented some of the policy decisions that have been made. And I think we need to do a better job of monitoring and being able to either pressure or call out the schools that haven't moved on some of the policy decisions that have been made, and agree with you 100%.
And again, I think that John, that's such an important point to make about the difference and the divide between plans and policies and even funding sometimes and actual implementation, because I think we've seen again and again in the system how there are a lot of good ideas and very well-intentioned plans, and they sometimes just fall apart in the implementation, and they don't ever get a chance to work. And so, Ariela, I would ask you as a follow-up question: is what's needed now? Is it more staffing and hiring, or is there another layer that's missing in terms of policy or even philosophy for these folks who you're describing as being resources that aren't always used by students?
Yeah, there definitely needs to be another layer. I know specifically, just looking at Boston, we don't meet the counselor to student ratio by a lot. Actually, only 2 states in the whole country do. So I do want to acknowledge that the new budget is actually pushing to have more counselors at school, but that, of course, that's helpful, but it doesn't have as big of an impact as it was if there was a standard for how we should treat our students, like really making sure that, it's human first and then focusing on teaching after, because you can only teach a student who wants to learn. And students, especially people who are affected in certain communities, only feel like they want to go to school, they want to engage when they feel like they have some connection with their staff or, with their schoolmates. Like, some students view school as a place to really escape and get away from some of the trauma that they face at home. And so it kind of becomes a challenge if you're facing both an issue at school and an issue at home. So that standard definitely needs to be there. There should be a course on, social emotional support that every BPS staff is required to take.
That seems like I hope that the mayor will reach out to you, Ariela, because I think you have outstanding ideas to share, and I really appreciate hearing them and you're making this issue part of our conversation. And I want to ask you, Yvonne, if you could talk a little bit more broadly about quality in our high schools and how do you think that the new mayor can further more equity in quality? We have a few high schools that are very well known, and we have others with tremendous potential. How does the mayor help tap that potential?
Absolutely. Happy to address high school and achievement quality. I wanted to quickly echo Ariela's call for greater social and emotional support. I think during the pandemic, this has been one of the most important areas that we have heard from families and students across the city. Lawyers for civil rights, we've been in contact with educators who say that it's not just students who are behind academically for 1 or up to 2 years, but also socialization is behind. The social and emotional support that families need in light of the pandemic is significant. And so those investments are important. I would say, in turning to the question of quality, one of the most frustrating things that we hear from the community is there's so much attention being paid to the exam schools and access to the exam schools, when in reality, we need to lift the educational standards across the board. And I would be the first one to agree with that. We need to lift all academic standards and the quality of schooling so that all our students have an opportunity to achieve, all our students have an opportunity to fully realize their potential, whether that means college, whether that means other pathways to success. But the bottom line is that access to the exam schools has become so important because they're some of the few schools that actually afford that type of pathway. And so how we address school quality is going to be a major issue in the coming mayoral term. And one of the most important things, I think, is not just school quality overall, but it's making sure that students of color and other students, immigrant students, students with disabilities, students who are in individual learning plans, that all of these students are able to close the achievement gap, because they are the ones who are particularly affected when we do not have a strong science-based literacy curriculum, for example, to teach students how to effectively read. And then we have students graduating from high school who cannot read at grade level. Students who are really disadvantaged by the lack of a focus on STEM education and really cutting edge, state-of-the-art programming and educational opportunities that get them ready for 21st century workplaces and 21st century learning. And so all of these gaps are things that are going to be up to the next mayor to really tackle head on. And the priorities need to come from City Hall. City Hall needs to invest not just in social and emotional learning to improve outcomes and the quality of schools, but in literacy, in STEM and technology. All of those are parts of the solution because there's no silver bullet here. It's a constellation of factors that we need to address. I see you nodding, John.
I am nodding. Not sure if we've lost Jenna, but I'll just jump in real quick, Yvonne. I, wanna agree, and I want to add on to. I think in order to do the things that you just spelled out, that we need to increase resources. It's really important that we continue to not just talk about the policies and services or things we need to do, but that we follow that with real money to do it at a high level, right? That we give more capacity to schools to implement these plans, and that means resources. So I'm a big proponent of adding resources to our budget. We tried to in the last administration and need to do a better job. I think there was a question in the Q&A box around facilities. It is past time for us to improve facilities, not just from a health and safety standpoint, but really to follow the kind of curriculum we're trying to implement. Ariela at the O'Brien, families worked for years at the O'Brien to try to create an innovation center at their school. And that's because they wanted a physical space to match the kind of curriculum the school was trying to push, was trying to support. And the city should, in fact, work with parents to do that at the O'Brien and every other school who is trying to have the right facility. So safety and health is important, but facilities that help support the programming aspect of what we need is critical. Ariela talked about emotional social support. Do the physical buildings, the facilities help to move the social emotional support agenda or program, or and many of them don't. Many of them are depressing and don't have enough lighting, or the bathroom is bad, or there's no warm water. I mean, a series of issues that don't support the kind of work that we're trying to do in our schools. So we have to have commitment. The next mayor has to be committed in a full-on investment priority for BPS and make sure that it gets the kind of budget attention it needs. I also want to recognize that John Mudd has a question in the Q&A. And John, you're right. The mayor is a very important voice in the firing and hiring of the superintendent, is a decisive voice, but works very closely with the school committee to do that. And so you have two pressure points. One is the mayor for sure, but the other are his appointees on the school committee. Don't let them off the hook. Make sure you're talking to them as they also talk to the mayor in any of these decisions.
And John, can I ask you too about another related issue that's coming up right now, which is about the school committee and whether or not members are appointed, elected, or some mix of the two. It's a complicated situation for a new mayor who's coming in at a time when that structure is being questioned and brought up for discussion. What would you think the mayor's approach should be if in fact voters do approve this ballot question, which is non-binding, but it's clear that there's a lot of support for the idea of having at least some elected members on the committee. What does that mean for the next mayor?
Jenna, just to share, I started my campaign as an appointed school committee proponent for a number of reasons, and I can get into it some other time. But by the time, midway through the campaign, I had heard from enough parents and enough people in the community about the importance of an elected school committee that I shifted my position to a hybrid, and I think if the question was to pass in this election, in this ballot, that the mayor should in fact look at some kind of elected model, a hybrid that moved the model. Because for me, the most important thing in government is the trust of the people. If we can establish trust in parents, in others, in students, if the students don't trust the system, if parents don't trust the system, there's going to be a huge breakdown in BPS's ability to implement the things that it's trying to do. So establishing trust is critical. And if moving to an elected school committee through hybrid or full elected school committee is going to do that, then I would argue that any mayor that is trying to be successful needs to hear the voice of the people and move the model into an elected model.
I just wanted
And does anyone else? Yeah, please go ahead, Ariela.
Yeah, so I think whether a school committee was fully elected or hybrid, it would be a lot more considerate. So really allowing like parents, students, community members, etc., their voices to be heard. But I also want to point out that the effect or the power of the elected school committee is really contingent on whether the city council is given more power, because it's also like still going to be a balance there. But I think that hybrid would be a good chance for our community to get a better understanding of civics in Boston as well, just having a mixture of the two.
And Yvonne, how about you? What are your thoughts?
I have to admit that I have oscillated on this issue. At first, I thought, well, it's one of those things that the mayor has under their tool belt as one of their powers and privileges. And so who am I as an advocate to be telling the mayor that they shouldn't have that privilege? And so I kind of felt that it wasn't necessarily the place of lawyers for civil rights to take a position on the issue. I have to admit, over time, my views on this have evolved. And now I am more on the camp of creating either a fully elected or, as Ariela put on the table, a hybrid system that allows the mayor to retain some of the power that the mayor's office has had historically, but that also returns some of that power to the people in terms of democratizing access to electing people for the school committee. And so my views have definitely evolved over time. And frankly, it's evolved because I have seen that so much work needs to happen to reform and improve our schools. And oftentimes with the politicization that happens with City Hall being a gatekeeper, that can be a hindrance to progress. And it is important to be able to push through reforms that may be politically unpopular for City Hall, but that may be much more viable for an elected school committee to get done. And so the political realities of when the rubber hits the road are really shaping the evolution of my view on devolving some of the power to make sure that is back in the hands of the people and the community, instead of creating and maintaining the system that allows gatekeeping unchecked at City Hall. And so my views on this have evolved, not because, not out of disrespect for City Hall, but just out of the practical realities that sometimes the reforms that we need on the ground are going to be unpopular with some quarters. Look, for example, at the reforms surrounding highly selective public schools, deeply unpopular in some quarters that the mayor's office traditionally listens to. Yet those reforms are incredibly important and were urgent. And so I think we're holding up progress by continuing to have a system that is not representative of the community voices and perspectives. And so I think that's an important element of this conversation about whether this body continues to be appointed or elected, or as Ariela very well put on the table, a hybrid system?
I appreciate all of you weighing in on that. It's a really interesting time to be watching what's going to be happening next, and I want to talk a bit more about those next steps. I also want to remind our listeners that we are allowing some time for questions from all of you. If you want to send us your questions, you can do so at the bottom of your screen. I believe it's the chat. Is it the chat box that they should enter those into? Hopefully you'll see which box has questions already posted there.
Yes, I
And you
think
can.
I think that there's a chat portion and then there's a Q&A portion right under it if you click on the more button.
Yeah, Jenna, we have a couple
Okay.
of questions already in the Q&A box.
You want to share any of those if they haven't been addressed?
I know the first one, an anonymous attendee raises the question, this pandemic has highlighted the inadequacies of the physical infrastructure and ventilation systems in our schools, with only 1/4 of them having HVAC systems. Stopgap measures have been instituted now, i.e. windows opened a few inches, making some classrooms freezing in the cold weather, and HEPA filters, but this is not adequate even for this pandemic, not to mention the next one. What should the plan be for addressing the glaring public health problems in Boston Public Schools? I tried to address a little bit of that, but I'm not sure if anybody wanted to do a little bit more on facilities. I think the same attendee then asked a secondary question, recognizing that it's important to discuss resources. BPS spends more per pupil than many other similar-sized districts in the U.S. How can we ensure better accountability for how those resources are allocated, since clearly BPS is well-funded and allocates almost $23,000 per pupil, and we still have seriously subpar facilities and lack many of the things that Ariela mentions. I'll say, agree. It's a great question. Both are great questions. Facilities, super important. And this question about accountability, right? And I think Ariela had mentioned some of that. There are things that we put in our budget that we still don't have in our schools. And then there's the question of when we do put them in place, how effective are they? And so there is a real need to make sure that quality and outputs, if you would, or impact needs to be measured so that it's not just about inputs. It's not just about more money or more programs or more bodies, but are the students getting what the students need? That's the fundamental question. And if they're not, then let's reallocate, let's shift, let's improve what we are providing in a way for it to be more impactful.
There's another question that I would like to get to here, because it's a tough one, and I think that all of you would have interesting insights. How would each of you advise the mayor on how to manage this thorny problem, which is we have in Boston in recent history kind of a revolving door for our school superintendents, most of whom have not stayed long enough to see through ambitious plans and to ensure steady progress in educational quality. So I think there is increasing, and this is a good thing, increasing recognition that that is a problem and that we need to invest in a superintendent and give him or her a chance to make change. At the same time, so many of our problems in the schools are so urgent and have gone on for far too long that we are all understandably anxious to see that change happen. So how would you advise a mayor to balance those two things? Wanting to give a superintendent, the current superintendent, time to get things done, but also needing to hold the superintendent accountable and ensure that change is really happening.
maybe I can get us started with this one. I have to say that as an advocate, as a civil rights attorney, at Lawyers for Civil Rights, an organization who's a watchdog, right? We are out there making sure that institutions are accountable at every level, local, state, federal, making sure that that there's no inequity in outcomes, disparities along racial lines. And we do that across many different areas of work, including education. We have been particularly loud about the experience of students of color and immigrant students in the Boston public school systems and pressuring for significant reform. One of those areas, for example, includes teacher diversity. We need more teachers that look like the students that are currently enrolled in the public schools. And especially when, as the census clearly indicated, the community continues to diversify rapidly, and our institutions are not keeping consistently with those trends, are not keeping up with what the demographic reality is on the ground and how we provide services to a rapidly diversifying community. Teachers are a key piece of that. Don't get me started on police officers and firefighters, because those are also important components here. But zeroing in on education, we've been really trying to get teacher diversity to be a priority, and we hadn't made much progress through the channels in City Hall. Working with the current superintendent, we've made some progress. Albeit it is slower than we wish, and I think a lot of that is because of the pandemic. But my point is, many of these things are again going back to this concept of priorities and gatekeeping from City Hall. We need to provide the superintendent with an opportunity to lead, and to lead from a place of student-centered and community-centered priorities. And if we are measuring the success of the superintendent by just keeping tabs on what City Hall politically wants to happen, that's going to be a point of deep frustration for many of us. And yet that tends to be the litmus test. And I think that explains much of the revolving door that we have had here in Boston. And so to the extent that we can provide a space for stability in the district, and for the superintendent to work with students and families and community in getting the schools really up to speed to where we want them to be, I think that would be terrific. But that requires providing space for priorities to be set outside of City Hall. That also means providing space for systemic and structural changes in the education system along the lines of the elected school committee we were just talking about. So all of that is a part of the puzzle here. And so I agree that this is a problem, but it's a problem that we can begin to address if we create the space for that.
And John or Ariela?
Ariela, I'll jump in here and give you some time. I think there's no question that in a system like BPS, you need some time to implement change. And Yvonne said it. We need to give some time, while at the same time putting in the mechanisms to hold the superintendent and leadership accountable. So that means that as we are moving towards something as a system, that we have benchmarks, that we have milestones that people can look at and see, are we making the kind of changes that we need to make? I'll talk about a couple of different policy areas that I think, over the years, for a very long time, we've lacked in, and people are still asking questions today about them. One is in the support for English language learners, right? We've I think made the right policy decisions, but implementation has lacked, and real implementation to provide the kinds of services that we need. And we need to talk about the milestones, the things, the metrics that we're going to look at to say we're moving in the right direction. We haven't, in fact, provided more access to native language instruction, which is something we've talked about and said we've needed, right? And we've passed, I think it was called the Look Act a few years ago, and we haven't, BPS hasn't really used that, I think, in ways that could. We said as a school system a long time ago that we were going to move to more dual language schools. We've done some more dual language programming, but we haven't moved on those kinds of policy decisions in ways that I think we could have and should for those students. I think same with students with disabilities. Once again, the students with IEPs deserve the services called out in their IEPs, and parents still have to fight for those services. And only parents who, Yvonne, have the right, legal representation typically get the kind of services that they need, and that should not be the case. And that's something that BPS has recognized and has said, in fact, that they need to do more on. But once again, are we making incremental improvements in those areas? Are we moving in the right direction? Can we set milestones and begin to hold the superintendent accountable, not for the end goal, understanding it's going to take some years to get there, but for progress? Every year, have we made progress? Have we moved the needle? And have we given the superintendent the resources that she needs? And if the answer is yes, then let's talk about the fact of progress has been met or hasn't been met, and what we should do about that immediately.
Yeah, I can quickly add on to this. So a big component is really making sure that the superintendent has the resources that they need. But there's two kind of main parts that I want to talk about. And first is civics, and just like civics classes in Boston, to make sure that our community can be in the position to be understanding for the superintendent. A lot of us are just like, our facilities have been terrible for years, or I've been noticing these things for years, but not really understanding the measures or the steps that we need to take in order to fix it. So we're seeing this like, no, this is a problem and this is just something that we can fix. Like, we kind of think about it as though it's just common sense, not really realizing that there's other steps and procedures that need to be put forth in order to solve those problems. So when we don't have that civic understanding, then we go to someone like the superintendent and we're like, hey, like, no, these things should be, flying like this. Like, these are changes that need to be made really, really fast. I've noticed, especially within my age group, we haven't been given the civics classes, or we don't have the level of, civic understanding that we need. A lot of the reason why I'm engaged in civics is because I work for the Boston Community Action Team. So we do a lot of voter canvassing. I've interned for a couple representatives, and because I debate. Policy debate is what really got me into understanding civics. And so when we don't have that outlet as students within our schools, and then, we were all students, like whether I'm currently a student in high school, you all graduated from high school or had some form of education, and that cycle continues. So we're not as able to be understanding, and the mayor is representing us in that. I'm also responsible for a group of people who don't understand why this isn't happening. And the next part for accountability is making sure, which I've noticed, is that people won't be accountable if no one is holding them accountable, or no one is really taking the measures to show that they care. And I think a big part of that could be the school committee. So having it as a hybrid system. So whether that's a group of people who are elected, as well as some officials who are a part of that, just making sure that we have a broad community who are able to hold our superintendent accountable on multiple levels, like coming from different backgrounds, I think would be really helpful.
It's just great to hear all of you mentioning some of these topics that we've written on as a team, that I think are so important to keep in the conversation, like English learners and students who need special education and civics. Absolutely. We have just a few minutes left, so I want to go around and have each of you offer what are your few most concise words of advice or words of wisdom for the next mayor? And John, why don't we start with you?
For the next mayor, I think be fully engaged. Get out, meet the advocates, meet the parent groups, meet the student leaders, meet the student body. Get out, meet your school leaders. Be fully engaged in the community. I don't think it's going to undermine the leadership of the superintendent or undermine the leadership of the school committee, but Boston needs you to be impacted by the engagement of the stakeholders in our schools, and needs you to be reminded always about how important the work of schools is. It is the most important, I think, department in our city. Not only is it 41% of your budget, but is in fact the most important thing that you can do to help Boston today and help our future tomorrow. And so that's the last and most concise thing I can say is do a tour of the schools, meet with students, meet with Ariela, and you'll know everything you need to know about what you should be doing these next 4 years.
That would definitely be mine. Meet with Ariela. 3 words.
Sure.
Ariela, how about you?
I would specifically bring it back to communication, especially after what happened with COVID. We have these it exposed a lot of inequalities and gave us more information about how we can serve our communities in a better way. And that also stands for the mayor. So being really communicative and making sure that it goes back to just treating everyone how you want to be treated. So, everyone is a human who is expected to do certain things within their own roles, but just being really communicative and honest about what role you play in maybe an issue that somebody else is facing.
Great advice. And I will turn it over to you, Yvonne.
I think we've given the mayoral candidates a terrific list of priorities, even during the Zoom call. We've talked about the urgency of social and emotional support structures. We've touched lightly, but nonetheless put it on the radar, that we need to focus on investments in the science of reading so that we can improve literacy and outcomes. We've talked about the importance of closing the digital divide to make sure that those disparities that Ariela just identified can be addressed through tech equity initiatives that allow our students not just to be connected right now to educational opportunities, but to be prepared for the future in the workplace or in academic settings. And I think other areas that we have talked about today are critical. What is the composition of the school committee and who gets to decide that? We will see what the ballot initiative holds. But even if the ballot initiative says that we should continue the current system, that still means that the next mayor needs to have a commitment to diversifying the school committee and to making sure that it is community accountable, that is representative of the community. All of these issues are really the path forward for the next mayor. And I want to elevate one last thing that John put on the table, which is the expansion of dual language programs, such as the Margarita Muñiz Academy. I mean, this is the checklist. And if the next mayor can tackle this checklist that Ariela, John, and I just set forth, working with you, Jenna and Delia, in this webinar, I think that we have a path forward that we can all be proud of.
I cannot possibly express my appreciation to all of you for bringing your best thinking here today to share with all of us. It's such an important conversation. I would gladly continue it on for another hour, but we're going to wrap it up here. I want to thank all 3 of you, John, Ariela, and Yvonne, for being with us. And I want to thank the Nellie Mae Foundation again for their support. And I hope that you all out there will continue to join us as we try to keep tackling these incredibly important issues going forward. Thank you all so much for coming.